I started in the records room because nobody else wanted to. That was my job, Cherry, Illinois. The winter of 1909. I was the clerk who kept the company's books for the Saint. Paul mine, and I was the man they handed the casualty ledger to after the fire. I want to tell you what I saw written there, and what I saw crossed out. 259 men. That is the number you will find in the histories now. It was not the number on the first page I was given. The mine sat at the edge of town, sunk into the prairie coal that the railroad needed. The shaft went down hundreds of feet. The men went down with it every morning, and on the 13th of November they did not come back up. I am not the hero of this account. I was a clerk, I counted things. But counting in a company town is its own kind of witness. A clerk sees the whole arithmetic of a place, the wages in, the settlements out, the names that quietly stop appearing on a Monday. Before I take you down into it, do this for me. Subscribe, not for me, for the names. Because the men in that ledger had families who spent decades being told the records were lost, and the only way the lost ones stay found is if people keep asking to see them. The archive does not protect itself. It needs witnesses. You are one now. Let me give you the ground first, the plain ground before the fire. Cherry was not an old town. It existed because the coal existed, and the coal mattered because the railroad burned it. There was no Cherry before the shaft. The town was built downward first and outward second. The St. Paul Coal Company ran the mine, the Chicago, Milwaukee St. Paul Railway stood behind the coal company. That is not a rumor. That is the structure of the thing. A railroad needs fuel, so a railroad builds a town around a hole in the ground and calls it an investment. Understand what a company town is. The company owns the mine. The company owns the store where you buy your flour. The company owns the house you sleep in, and the church land and the doctor's contract. So when something goes wrong in the mine, the company is also the landlord, the grocer, the doctor, and very nearly the coroner. There is no neutral ground in a company town. Even the ledger I kept was the company's ledger. Hold that thought. It is the whole point of what comes later. The men were Italian, Polish, Lithuanian, Scottish, Irish. Some had been in the country a year. Some had been in the mines since boyhood, because the law about boys in mines was a suggestion more than a wall. There were boys in that shaft on the day it burned. I knew their wages. I knew them by the number of cars they brought up, not by their faces. They were paid by the ton. Not by the hour, not by the danger, by the ton. Remember that. It explains why men kept working a vein when they smelled smoke. The smoke might cost you a lung. Stopping cost you the day's bread. The pay structure is why men were deep in the rooms instead of near the cage when the fire took the shaft. Now the catalyst. The mine used electric lights, but the power failed that autumn, so they went back to open kerosene torches in the shaft. Think about that sentence. A modern mine, lit by electricity, falls back to open flame underground because the electric system is unreliable and nobody stops the coal for it. On the afternoon of November 13, a car of hay for the mules that hauled the coal, was left sitting near one of those torches. The hay caught. That is how it begins, not with a villain in a tall hat. With a car of hay, a kerosene flame, and a decision to keep the mine running on torches, because the electric system was down and the coal was due. That is the part that haunts a clerk. There was no monster. There was a schedule. There was a quota. There was a railroad that needed its fuel and a coal company that needed its tonnage. And the gap between those two needs was filled with kerosene light and a car of dry hay. The fire took the timber. The timber held up the world above the men, and the timber burned. Smoke poured down the shaft instead of out of it. The ventilation system, the thing that should have pulled poison up and away, was reversed for a time, and it pulled the smoke down into the rooms where men were still loading cars by the ton. The very machine built to keep them breathing carried the killing air to them. Some got out. A cage came up burning with men on it. 12 men volunteered to ride the cage back down again and again to pull others out. And on the last trip, the signals failed, and the cage stayed below too long, and it did not come back with them alive. They are remembered now. They were remembered slowly. The town built to a rescuer is always built last, after the lawyers are finished with the dead. And then the company did a thing that the histories record plainly. To stop the fire from spreading and consuming the entire mine, the shafts were sealed with men still alive below. I need you to sit with that the way I had to sit with it. The decision was defended at the time as the only way to save the mine itself, and perhaps to save anyone who might survive in a sealed pocket of air. I am not here to pretend it was simple. Fire feeds on air. Cut the air and you cut the fire. The same logic that might smother the flames would smother the men. I am telling you it happened, and that it is written down, because this is the one fact nobody tried to bury. It was too large to bury. 8 days later, they opened the seals. And here is where my ledger and the public record begin to disagree. 21 men came out of that sealed mine alive. 8 days under the ground, in the dark, rationing the air, drinking water that dripped from the rock. One of them, a man named George Eddy, kept the others moving, kept them from lying down, because to lie down in that air was to not get up. They had scratched a will into a piece of timber, words for the families they expected never to see. That part is true, and that part survived, because survival makes a clean number, and clean numbers are easy to keep. The living are countable. The living can sign for their own wages. The dead are where the counting got difficult. When the recovery began, the bodies came up over weeks. Some were so burned they could not be named. Some were buried in a common grave because there was nothing left to separate one man from another. And the ledger I kept had a column for compensation beside each name. And that column is the one I watched change. Let me be precise about what I can say and what I cannot. I can say the disaster was real. November 13, 1909. The St. Paul Mine at Cherry, Illinois. 259 men. The St. Paul Coal Company operated it. The Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railway stood behind the coal company. Those are anchors. You can pull on them and they hold. They are in the newspapers of the time, the state reports, the gravestones. What I watched in the months after was the work of turning 259 deaths into a manageable liability. Not a tragedy, a liability. That is the word the men above the coal company would have used. A number with a dollar sign in front of it, and a job to make that number small. The ownership chain ran upward, the way these chains always do. Coal company to railway. And above the railway, in the rail and coal fortunes of that age, the same handful of Gilded Age names appear again and again, intertwined through holding companies and directorships and shared capital, the rail dynasties that had built and bought lines across the country. The Gilded Age did not invent the corporation, but it perfected the art of standing behind one. A man could own the engine that burned the coal, the company that dug the coal, and the bank that lent the company the money, stand still when the shot fire, be 3 handshakes away from any signature that mattered. I will tell you what people said in the town. They said the chain ran up through the great rail families, that the Vanderbilt rail interests touched everything that moved coal in those years, that the money behind the road behind the mine led back to names carved on mansions in New York. And here I have to stop and refuse to lie to you. I cannot put a Vanderbilt signature on the order to seal that mine. I never saw one. The man who told me the name had heard it from a man who had heard it from a man. The Vanderbilt fortune was built on rail, on the New York Central and the lines that grew from it. And rail and coal were one body with 2 names in that era. But I will not draw a straight line from a famous family to this specific shaft, when the line I actually saw ran only as high as the road, the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul, and then vanished into paper. What I can tell you, and what the records of Gilded Age railroading will support, is that the ownership of American rail and coal in 1909 was a tangle of interlocking interests, and that the men at the top of those tangles were insulated, deliberately, by layers of corporate paper from the hole in the ground where the bodies were. That is the first thing I refuse. I refuse to hand you a famous name as if it were a confession. The structure is the crime here, not a signature, and the structure is documented. You do not need a villain when you have a system that was designed on purpose so that no single person would ever have to sign for the dead. Now the discovery, the thing I actually found. The first casualty ledger I was given listed compensation amounts beside the dead. Small amounts, a few $100s to a widow with 5 children, the figure of a man's whole life, written in a clerk's hand, and the figure was the price of a horse. And then, weeks later, I was given a second ledger, a clean one, bound the same and told to copy the names across. Just transcribe, they said. The first book is getting worn. The amounts in the second ledger were different, some lower, some simply blank, a name with no number beside it at all, as though the man had cost nothing. And the men who had been listed as company employees in the first book were, in the second, listed under a contractor, a subarrangement, a layer of paper that had not existed on the morning of November 13. I want to stack the anomalies for you, because one of them is a mistake, and several of them together are a method. First, the shift of men from direct employment to a contractor's role after their deaths. A dead man cannot be hired by anyone. He cannot sign a new arrangement, yet his category changed between one book and the next. The only reason to move a dead man to a contractor is to move the bill for his death somewhere. The railway could not be reached. Second, the compensation column rewritten downward, with no note explaining why a widow's settlement fell between one book and the next. In a proper ledger, every change carries a reason. An entry crossed out shows its correction. These were not corrections, they were replacements. The first number simply ceased to have ever existed. Third, whole pages where the cause of death was left as a dash, not suffocation, not burns, a dash, as if the men had simply stopped. A cause of death is what a family needs to be paid, what a court needs to assign fault. Leave it as a dash, and you have a dead man no one is responsible for. Fourth, and this is the one that kept me awake, a note in the margin of the first book, in a hand that was not mine, that read confirm with road before settling. The road, the railway. As if no widow could be paid until the railway above the coal company had reviewed the figure. The coal company was supposedly the employer. The coal company was supposedly liable. But the coal company would not pay $1 until the road said the dollar was acceptable. That margin note is the whole chain in 4 words. The money flowed down, so the permission flowed down, and the liability was meant to stop at the bottom. I was not the only one who saw these things. The coroner's assistant, a young man whose name I will not give because his children may still be living, came to me one night through the back of the office. He had his own book. The coroner of Cherry was holding inquests, as the law required, and the inquest record and my company ledger were supposed to agree on a simple fact. How many and how each man died, they did not agree. He told me that bodies he had personally tagged were not appearing in the company's count by the same names, that identifications he had made by a wedding ring, by a tool, by a scrap of letter in a pocket, were being reopened and changed, and men he had named were sliding back into the column of the unknown. The unknown are cheaper. The unknown have no widow standing at the office door with a name and a date, that when he raised it, he was told the records were being consolidated. Consolidated. That was the word. I have learned to be afraid of that word. When a powerful institution tells you its records are being consolidated, it often means they are being made smaller. Consolidation is how 2 numbers become 1, how a discrepancy becomes a clerical preference, how the book that disagrees is folded into the book that agrees, and then the disagreeing book is no longer needed. He corroborated what I had only suspected. 2 of us, 2 books, the same wound. I had thought I might be imagining the pattern. But here was a second man, in a different office, under a different seal, watching the same names be edited toward zero. 2 witnesses, that is what turns a suspicion into a record. And then came the part this account is named for. There was a fire in the company office, a small one, contained quickly. Nothing like the fire below, no one hurt, barely a story in the next county. But when it was out, the first casualty ledger, the one with the original compensation figures and the margin note about the road, was gone. Burned, they said, lost in the office fire. The clean second book, the one with the lower numbers and the contractor's roll, was untouched on its shelf. How convenient that the only book that disagreed with the official count was the only book the fire chose. A fire that could find one ledger among hundreds and leave the rest. A very literate fire. Here is the second thing I refuse. I refuse to call that an accident, and I refuse to call it arson, because I cannot prove either. And a man who counts for a living should not guess at the thing he cannot count. I did not see a hand strike the match. I will not invent one for you. What I can tell you is the pattern, and the pattern does not need me to assign a motive. The pattern is this: the disaster was too big to hide, so it was not hidden. 259 is a public number. It was in every paper in the country. But the machinery underneath, who was owned by whom, who owed what to whose widow, which layer of paper stood between the railway and the grave, that machinery was made to disappear. The large truth survived as a monument. The small truths that would have cost money were the ones that burned. You can mourn a number freely. A number does not testify. A ledger testifies. I will give the defense its hearing, because an honest account must. Records were genuinely chaotic. A mine had burned. A town was in mourning. Bodies came up over weeks. Identifications were hard, and clerical confusion in such a disaster is not by itself proof of a cover. A second ledger might simply be a cleaner copy of a damaged first. A dash might be an inquest not yet completed, not a refusal. The office fire might have been exactly what they said, a stove or a lamp, and the lost book the unluckiest casualty of the year. And sealing the mine was defended, fiercely and in good faith by some, as the only way to stop the fire from taking everyone, the surface buildings, the rest of the workings, the chance of any pocket of survivors. The men who opened the seals and found 21 alive could say, with reason, that the seal had saved those 21. I cannot dismiss that. I will not. The shift of liability through corporate layers was technically legal. That is the worst part. Most of what I watched was legal. The contractor arrangement, the holding company, the review by the road before settling, all of it sat inside the law of 1909. No statute was broken in moving a dead miner onto a contractor's roll. The law simply had not imagined that anyone would. And the law of 1909 was the problem. Because here is what the disaster did do, and this is real, and you can verify it. The death of those 259 men and the public horror that followed, the photographs, the widows, the boys in the common grave, helped force the state of Illinois to move toward a workman's compensation law in 1910 and the years just after. For the first time, a miner's widow would not have to prove the company's negligence in a court she could not afford against lawyers paid by the road. The fault did not have to be found. The death was enough. The dead at Cherry bought that for the living who came after. So the men were not paid what they were owed, but their deaths changed the price of the next death. The widow of 1909 was edited down to a dash. The widow of 1915 had a law behind her, because the widow of 1909 was edited down to a dash, and the country saw it and was ashamed. That is the cruelest arithmetic in this whole account. Reform is paid for in advance by the people who never see it. That is the implication I want you to carry out of here. The shields are still standing. The layers of corporate paper that stood between the railway and the widow in 1909 have descendants, and the descendants wear better clothes. The shell company, the contractor of record, The parent that does not control the subsidiary, the file that is being consolidated, the records that, when a court finally asks for them, turn out to have been lost in a move, a merger, a server, a fire. We did not abolish the machine that I watched rewrite a dead man's employer. We made it neater. We gave it lawyers. We gave it the phrase plausible deniability, which is only confirmed with road before settling in a newer hand. When a modern disaster happens, and the ownership turns out to run up through 3 holding companies into a name you will never see in court, into a man who can say truthfully that he never signed anything that is not new. That is Cherry. That is the St. Paul Coal Company and the road behind it, wearing a better suit. The torch became a spreadsheet. The margin note became an email that gets deleted under a retention policy. But the shape is the same shape. The money flows down, so the liability is built to stop at the bottom, where the bodies are. I kept one thing. The young coroner's assistant gave me a copy, a transcription in his own hand, of a single page from the first ledger before it burned. The page with the margin note, confirm with road before settling. I have it still, folded into a Bible where no one would think to consolidate it. It is not proof of a famous man's guilt. I have told you twice now that I will not pretend it is. It is proof of something smaller and harder to argue with. It is proof that a railway reviewed the price of a miner's life before that price was paid. That is enough. That is more than they wanted to survive. They will tell you the records burned. They will tell you the figures were consolidated, that the original book was lost, that no one can say now what the first numbers were. They will say it kindly, even regretfully, the way a man says a thing he has said many times. But I was the clerk. I copied the names across, and the names remember even when the numbers do not. The archive was never destroyed. It was just buried. Next time we follow a single family up the chain. The Halsteads. The year is 1921. A textile fortune. A mill fire in a building with the doors chained. And an insurance file that, by the time the lawyers were done, recorded fewer dead than the church recorded funerals. The mill kept 2 sets of books, the same as Cherry, and only 1 set was ever meant to leave the building. They counted the bodies twice, and only one of the counts was meant to be found. The archive was never destroyed. It was just buried.